You're listening to the Journey Podcast. In today's episode, we embark on a compassionate and vital discussion about suicide awareness, guided by our guest's personal journey of loss. This episode contains a discussion about suicide and addiction. Some listeners may be triggered by this content, and listener discretion is advised. If you are in the US and need support, please call the USA Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988 or use the crisis text line at 741-741. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Journey Podcast. Welcome to the special episode for World Suicide Prevention Day. We would like to dedicate this episode in memory of AnneMoss's son, Charles Rogers, the beautiful Ashley Morrison, also known as the youngest old cat lady, and all of our loved ones who suffered so deeply and left us much too soon. In this profoundly personal and impactful episode, we are honored to be joined by AnneMoss Rogers, a renowned mental health speaker, trainer, and suicide loss survivor. AnneMoss shares her transformative journey from experiencing the devastating loss of her youngest son, Charles, to becoming a beacon of hope and expertise in the fields of emotional wellness and suicide prevention. Through authentic storytelling and compassionate insights, she offers listeners a safe space to explore the often stigmatized topics of mental health and suicide. AnneMoss Rogers is a recognized expert in mental health and suicide education, sharing her insights on platforms like TEDx and holding a certification in suicide prevention training. Her memoir, Diary of a Broken Mind, chronicles her personal journey following the tragic suicide of her son Charles in 2015, which inspired a viral newspaper article and her influential blog, Emotionally Naked. In 2021, she co-authored Emotionally Naked, A Teacher's Guide to Preventing Suicide and Recognizing Students at Risk with Dr. Kimberly O'Brien. Celebrated by major outlets like the New York Times and Variety magazine, AnneMoss notably spoke on youth suicide at the National Institute of Mental Health and contributes to the American Academy of Pediatrics Blueprint for Youth Suicide Prevention. Here is my interview with AnneMoss Rogers. Welcome to this very special episode of the Journey Podcast. Today, I am honored to have AnneMoss Rogers with us. AnneMoss, thank you so much for joining us for our World Suicide Prevention Day episode. Your voice and wisdom on this immensely important and often overlooked topic are invaluable, and I know our listeners will gain a lot from hearing your story and insights today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, I really appreciate your focusing on this topic, Petra. I just want to extend that thank you because talking about suicide prevents suicide.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know that your personal story is one of both incredible heartbreak and also hope. And would you like to share some of that journey with us, particularly about your son, Charles, and how that has led you to come and speak with us today?
Sure. So Charles was my younger child. I had two boys. I raised two boys, and they were 2.5 years apart. And they were pretty much each other's best friend as younger kids. And as Charles started, I'd say middle school, I saw some issues in elementary school, and I saw some in middle school. So in middle school, we sent him to private school, and we didn't have as many options to do that in high school because my son had a sleep disorder, and most of the high schools that were private were too far away and started too early. So he would have gotten even less sleep. So he goes into high school and he ends up on the homecoming court as a sophomore, which is pretty rare. I mean, Charles was like insanely popular wherever he went. I mean, he would go to camp and within a day, he'd be like the most popular kid there. He was just one of those effervescent people who lit up the room when he walked in and everyone wanted to know him. And he was funny. Oh my gosh, he was so funny. And it was hard to imagine that this hilarious individual that seemed to love life would take his life. And so he's on homecoming court and he ends up right after that, I'd say within weeks, his drug use starts to escalate by a lot. And I'm like, all these great things are happening. These things don't add up. What I didn't know is that my son was using drugs and alcohol to numb feelings of suicide. And to a teenager, he's thinking, well, doing drugs and alcohol is better than killing myself, right? So in that moment, yeah, it worked. But of course, down the road, it is what really pushed him towards suicide because he became addicted to heroin eventually. His drug use, once it escalated, his dad and I are like, well, is this mental illness? Is it substance misuse? Is it all of the above? And we would go and try to get help. And we got more questions and even fewer answers. I always asked for a diagnosis. And I remember asking a social worker one time if he would get a diagnosis. I didn't use the phrase psychological evaluation, and I wish I would have. And I said, do you think he might be depressed? And he goes, oh, no, Charles is not depressed. Case closed. And the next thing he did was recommend a wilderness program. So far, he had recommended medication in a wilderness program, but didn't bother to do a 1-hour psychological evaluation that would have cost us all of $50. And I got that feedback a lot. Went to another licensed clinical social worker, pretty much gave me the same kind of runaround. And I can't really figure out why. And then I called the county and they said, we're sorry, we can't help you because apparently I made too much money to qualify for them to do it for me. So when he went to Wilderness and we had to plan to have my son kidnapped out of his bed and taken to this program, and that was an insanely difficult decision. The planning absolutely sucked because you're going behind your child's back. And and they don't know. And that 2 weeks was absolutely miserable because you feel so deceptive and awful. And you have to sign away your parental rights. They take him. I remember the look he gave me as they're escorting him out. And it could have burned a hole in my forehead. And I felt so ashamed. And I still remember that look, but we were desperate. Because this isn't something you do because you've caught your kid with a beer and a joint. You really do it because you're desperate, and we were desperate. So one of the first things they do is, guess what? A psychological evaluation. And I'm like, finally. So we get a diagnosis, but unfortunately, Wilderness is like a $32,000 step. It's probably even more now. So the money that I had saved up for a kitchen renovation for about 10 years was gone in all of 10 weeks. And from there, they recommended a therapeutic boarding school. We finally got a diagnosis of depression and anxiety. We knew that he had a sleep disorder called delayed sleep phase syndrome. They also said that he had ADHD, which we already knew about. So he had a lot of risk factors for suicide, but they never discussed suicide with us. And he clearly showed signs there, and he clearly showed signs at therapeutic boarding school. But again, nobody ever mentioned it to me. Nobody ever took the opportunity to educate me. And when I would ask them, what does high risk mean? They would just glaze over the question and ignore it. I think it's because we don't educate our clinicians on suicide very well. And that's one of the reasons I pair with my co-writer on my second book, Dr. Kim O'Brien, and we teach a class on safety planning and risk assessment for suicide. So to move on with the story, he comes back in 2014, having spent some 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement. What I didn't know is Charles went immediately back to doing drugs and alcohol because that was the way he coped. And when your child is young and they start coping with drugs and alcohol, it sort of robs them of the ability to develop any other coping strategies. And he wasn't willing. And by this time, he's pretty jaded against the mental health system. And who could blame him? To him, this worked much faster. I was seeing that it wasn't working. I saw that the marijuana was causing psychosis. It was causing more anxiety. It was causing more sleep disruption. But he wasn't seeing that, and I couldn't tell him that. And at that time, I wasn't doing as much drug testing on a 19-year-old as I had on a 15-year-old. I was kind of tired at that point. And asking your 19 or 20-year-old to pee in a cup, it does get old. And it wasn't easy to get him to do it because it was an all-day event. He made it difficult. I can't pee right now, blah, blah, blah. So he would end up becoming addicted to heroin. He would finally admit that to us. Although he didn't admit to being addicted to heroin, he said an opiate. Because who wants to be known as a heroin addict, right? That's dripping with stigma. And he didn't want that. He was ashamed. And I was not ashamed of him. I will say that. But I will say I didn't really know exactly what to do other than what they tell you to do. And once he went to detox and recovery, and then he went to a recovery house, he ended up relapsing within about 24 hours. So what I didn't know is those who go through withdrawal and those who are addicted to a substance are about 15 times more likely to die by suicide. Nobody had ever told me that statistic either. On the way to the detox, because the manager of the recovery house had a protocol. And he said, here's what we do. We go to the hospital, we get him cleared. Then we go to the psych hospital, we get mental health evaluation, suicide risk evaluation. And then he goes back to detox for 3 days, and then he can come back to the recovery house. Well, he went through that process. They took him to the psych hospital. They refused to do the evaluation because they said they didn't take those people anymore, meaning people who are addicted to a substance, making my son feel like human garbage. Now, I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know it till afterwards. Once he gets there, he sees a friend, and the two of them walk out because they just want one more party. And for 2 weeks, we don't know where he is. We get the occasional text. I have a last phone call that I don't know is my last phone call. And then we're out to dinner one night and we get a phone call from the police and they say, we're going to meet you in the parking lot. And I'm like, what is this about? And then it hit me. They're coming to tell me my child is dead. And that's exactly what they did. And we're screaming and wailing. And my husband says, well, how did he die? And I remember thinking that was a crazy question, but of course it's a normal question. But in my mind, I was sure it was overdose. And then the policeman said it was a suicide and the method left no question. And I just remember there feeling like there was this extra twist in the knife, like, oh my God, didn't he know we love him? My love wasn't enough. This is my fault. And immediately you go into that self-blame mode because it is preventable. They died at their own hand. And surely I could have been Superman and prevented this. And obviously I couldn't. At that moment, I didn't understand why suicide, and it would be a very long time before I would, Petra. I mean, lots of research, but mostly talking with people with lived experience. That's where I've learned the most. And those beautiful people who so generously shared their story of survival and how they felt in that moment. I've learned more from people in that moment than from anyone else.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your journey and Charles's journey and your family's journey with us. And my heart goes out to you and everyone who has lost someone who left much too soon. And that's why we're here talking today, to really discuss the stigma that still remains, the challenges that remain in getting help and support, often the labels that we receive and that our loved ones receive when, there is a substance misuse involved or there are addictions involved. It somehow seems like then everyone becomes lesser people, lesser of a person. So I think it's so important that we highlight this and we talk about that. I feel that in sharing together in these experiences, well, we keep the memory alive of our loved ones, first of all, as well, but we also heal through that. We get to understand that there's no shame in that. There's no guilt in that. And everyone deserved a helping hand. Everyone deserved to have, like you said, that diagnosis and that support that they needed. So I'm very glad that you're here sharing that today. And I want to ask, because you found out after your son had passed away that he had written lyrics, and you got a special insight into how he was feeling and thinking in the time leading up to his death. How did that change what you knew about him from your side? How did that feel, actually getting a look into his brain and his thoughts and how he looked at the world? How did that feel after?
It was very, very hard. I remember at first we didn't have his notebooks, and when they delivered the backpack, it had 7 of his notebooks in there, and he probably had maybe up to 30 at that point. So we've never recovered the rest of those, but I'm grateful for what I have. And I started reading them, and I couldn't make it through more than one per day for a very, very long time. It wasn't until 2 years later when I sat down to read the book, and still I could only read like 2 a day. I mean, it was intensely difficult because I got to know my son through his lens. I got to know another side of my child that I never knew. I didn't know he had so much pain and agony. And those lyrics were a way for him to express that. I mean, it was a great coping strategy. And if it weren't for the drugs, I really think Charles could have made it, because he was such a loving person. And he responded really well to that. But I mean, always all these lyrics about wanting to die and feeling like he was nothing, and the shame he felt for the drug abuse. There were a few hopeful songs too, but mostly they were dark. And it was like I was transported to being able to see everything from his point of view. And then I started to feel kind of bad about myself, because I saw times I'm like, and he never wrote anything. I'm about in every rap song he ever wrote. And it's not mean. It wasn't that he made accusations that I did this to him, but I would look back and go, oh man, there's so many times I was like pushing the toxic positivity on him, Like, I remember being on the deck one day. He came out there and he was talking about his rap music, and he was working on his second album. I had heard his first album, and those were the only lyrics I'd ever heard. And I said, can't you be a little bit more positive? I mean, that had to be such a slap in the face. And it was just like I was just trying to push him into the light, and that was his coping mechanism. And it was kind of like I was saying, well, you write these depressing lyrics and it keeps you in your sadness. And that's not true. Writing really helps you express it and move forward. And a lot of people overinterpret from what you write. Like at the therapeutic boarding school, they would take away what he wrote because they didn't like what he wrote. And they never told me what it was. So I always kept telling them, don't take away his writing. It works and he needs it. So I never did that. I always encouraged him to write whatever it was. But when it came to his music, my issue was that I thought it would negatively influence others. And what it did instead, and it took me a really long time to really understand this, is people connected with that pain and they felt less alone. So I thought it would push them towards the edge of ending their own life. And it did the opposite. It took me a really long time to kind of get why that was. And I can't really explain that. So I put his lyrics in the book in every other chapter after the third chapter, because I wanted my readers to understand our family story from his point of view. I didn't feel like it was only fair for me to present my point of view and not his. But boy, I had to pick the songs that went in the book. It was really hard. But that whole year I worked on the book, it was very cathartic and it was very healing. You're looking at every aspect, you're rewriting. And the first two chapters were the hardest to write because I'm really talking about the death in the first two chapters, and then kind of going back in time and telling the whole story. I had to rewrite that 21 times. So 21 times I had to sit in the back of that car and experience what it was like and relate that. And I didn't do it at first because I thought nobody wants to know that. And my friend Susan says, yeah, they do. You got to put that part in there. And I'm like, well, nobody will read it. And she goes, that's what you got to do. So she really kind of pushed me into it. And I remember sitting with that advice for a week before I dove in and said, but I can tell you once I did that, so much healing happened as I wrote it and as I experienced it. And I mean, my desk wet. I went through boxes of Kleenex. But crying and experience, you can't heal if you can't feel. You have to feel those feelings. You can't push them away. And when you push them away, they come back like a boomerang on steroids. You have to experience them. That taught me to do that. And that's when I really recognized how quickly it was happening. Now, I'll never be like fully healed or, cured. I'll always live with the grief. I'll always have times that I cry. But I am at a time in my life where I can find joy. I can laugh. I can be with people. I can enjoy doing things. I can look at movies of him and I can laugh and I can cry at the same time. So while there's sadness, there's also beauty and beautiful memories and I feel very fortunate to have had someone so spectacular in my life, even for the short 20 years he was in it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And is there anything that you learned after your son died and that you know now that you wish you would have known before? Anything that might also help other parents who might have children who are struggling or might not be sure if their children are struggling? Anything that you have learned that you wish you would have known back then?
So much, but I'd have to say the main one is listen more and lecture less. I was so focused on fixing and offering solutions that there were times I did allow him to feel heard, but he needed to know that I was really listening to him. And I also wish I would have told him, as much as I want you to get well, I love you even if you don't. He thought my love was conditional on him being healthy and recovery. But of course, I loved him when he was addicted. And of course, I prefer him in recovery. But I love him either way. I do regret that I didn't tell him in that way. I told him I loved him. He needed to hear it was unconditional. I think he really needed to know that. And I am proud of myself for when he did confess that he was addicted to an opiate. I did my best job of listening at that point. I let him talk, and there were long stretches of silence, and I let it sit. I asked him questions. I gave him feedback. on what I was hearing. And it was like, man, I put it all together finally. It takes a lot of work to understand that. So I actually teach those skills. And I teach a class to parents, and I do them in a lot of school systems. So I'll go and I'll train the teachers, I'll talk to the students, and then I talk to the parents. And I have 9 strategies for building resilience in your kids. So I teach them what to look for if your kids are in crisis so you can prevent it. But how can we go upstream and prevent them from getting a crisis in the first place? How can we build resilience and be more intentional about that as parents? Because I don't want other people standing in my shoes. I don't want other parents to have to go through this.
Yeah, and that's wonderful work that you're doing and sharing that, because I do think that there are opportunities where we can help and we can offer support to maybe have this take a different turn and end up differently. Maybe not in all cases, but we can always try. And I think that's also that message of hope that I hear very often when you give a talk or a presentation, that there is that message of hope as well. And do you have any coping skills or practices that you think might help listeners who may have experienced a loss like yourself and who may have lost a loved one? Anything that you can leave them with today that might help them cope with the situation?
I think allowing the feel your feelings. So the grief would come over me. It would take me to the floor, and I would curl up into a ball, and I would scream and cry and kick the walls. And what I would realize is that, or I would find out later, is that lasts about 60 to 90 seconds, that real intense part. People are afraid of it, but just let it in, because it doesn't last forever. And then, because as it's happening, healing is happening. It is getting you close to a place where you can go do things and be more like a normal person. You'll never be the person you were before. You'll be a more beautiful person, one that has learned a lot, because when you come back from tragedy, you just are a different person, and they are some of the most beautiful people that I've ever met. And it's like, I want to be like that. I want to be like that. The second thing is break things down into micro steps. I didn't want to get out of bed in the morning for at least 2.5 years. The way I got out of bed is, AnneMoss, all you have to do is put your feet on the floor. That's all you have to do. And then after that, I would say, do you need to go to the bathroom or brush your teeth? I would break it down in teeny tiny doable steps, because I couldn't, it was too overwhelming to think, I've got to get up and get ready, and I can't do all that, because I was just incapable of taking all that on in my mind. And that really helped me move through my day. So when I would come to a task that seemed very insurmountable, I said, what needs my attention right now? And how can I break that down in the smallest steps? And sometimes I had to write it all out. That really helped me a lot too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I hope that that also helps some of our listeners who might be experiencing that pain, the loss, and the grief, and struggling to put one foot in front of the other. So maybe they find some comfort in that message of hope. And as you said, I think that we never heal from a death of a loved one who died by suicide, but we learn to accept, and eventually we find some joy in the memories we shared, the times we shared, and also a lot of gratitude that we get to have them in our lives. So hopefully at some point we reach that place where we can watch the videos and look at the photos and feel that love in our hearts. And we carry that loss still, but it does feel like there's a point of acceptance that comes at some point. So yeah, now you also have some resources to share with our listeners today. And maybe also, I'm not sure, do you want to share just some of the US suicide resources, and then also resources that you are planning and putting together and that you offer?
Oh, yeah, I'm always doing some kind of an interview. A lot of times it's related to either parents or our education system, like what can we do in schools and how can we work with schools, that kind of thing. because I am insanely curious what everybody else is doing. And I like to bring those ideas to other areas, and I like to hear them and share them because I do a lot of consulting, I do a lot of speaking, and I really believe in sort of making all those connections. In terms of resources, I've written a lot of ebooks, and I have a website called Mental Health Awareness Education. Or you can look up my name, AnneMoss Rogers, or you can look up Emotionally Naked. You can find it there. But I have on the books page, I have both the books that I've written, but a ton of free ebooks. I've got one called Finding Your Purpose, and it is 2 pages long. I have ones about what to do if your child is thinking of suicide. What do you do as a parent? Because I've been there. Signs of depression. And I talk about not just the ones you see on the list of all the websites, but sort of those lesser known ones and those little gut feelings that you get, and then how to respond to somebody. So you're not saying, well, you should get more exercise. You're basically invalidating somebody's feelings that way. So I do, and of course, I travel all over the country and I do virtual presentations because I'm a professional speaker and trainer now. I used to be in digital marketing, and then I sold that business and decided to do this full time because it was helping me heal. And I needed, I guess, to heal in public for some odd reason. And it's really helped me. And I think it's really the connections and other people that have helped me.
Yeah. And I think our lives are just a much richer for your decision to talk in public and be part of that conversation publicly. So thank you. And we will be linking to AnneMoss's resources for you as well. So be sure to check the show notes for how you can find the ebooks and other talks that AnneMoss has given, some of the presentations she has done, and also any upcoming events that she might be hosting or planning. We will link to those. And we will also link to some of the suicide resources if you are in crisis or you know someone who is in crisis. We will link to some of the places where you can go and find help if you need that right now. And as we close this deeply impactful episode, I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to AnneMoss Rogers for joining us and for her incredible vulnerability and wisdom that she has gathered through her journey. It has been an absolute privilege to have you share your story and expertise with us today. And if you have lost someone to suicide, know that you are not alone and that conversations like these are a step toward healing and preventing future tragedies. So let's carry this dialogue forward, both as a tribute to those we have lost and as a promise to those who are still with us and who might be suffering. Thank you for tuning into this very special episode for World Suicide Prevention Day. Thank you, AnneMoss, and take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Journey podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Journey on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejourney.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.